Recently, VIOFO released firmware version 1.1_0817 for the VIOFO A119 Mini dash camera. In that firmware update, they added HDR or High Dynamic Range video recording support. There are two new firmware settings, one called HDR and the other called HDR Time. In the HDR setting, you can set it to off, which is the default value, on, which will have it record HDR video all the time, and then the third one is auto, which allows it to use the HDR time schedule in the other setting to define when HDR recording video is enabled. So then in the HDR time, you go define the start and end times, and those time ranges are geared towards nighttime recording for HDR video. When I had firmware version 1.1_0817 installed back on August 26th, here's some sample footage from that date, and you can see the video with HDR enabled has a very strange color scheme to it and very yellow in a lot of cases, and I reported that information to VIOFO. VIOFO adjusted the firmware so that the color wouldn't appear as yellow in the HDR enabled mode, and they provided me firmware version 1.1_0902 to test. Here I'm comparing the video generated on two different dates, so be aware of that. And the firmware versions are different, but it's from the same camera. On the top, we have the 0817 firmware release that added HDR support, and the HDR setting is set to on. And on the bottom, I have my test firmware from VIOFO, the 0902 firmware release. And again, HDR is set to on. I'm doing this to compare the colors between the two different firmware versions from the same general area, but also note that the sky in the 0902 firmware is a little off color because there's a large wildfire in the area generating a lot of smoke. And you can see the colors have improved in certain situations with the 0902, but it needs to get a lot better before I would say it's acceptable in my opinion. I haven't captured any video footage from the A119 Mini with HDR enabled at night yet until I get these color issues resolved with a firmware release from VIOFO. The remainder of this video will contain video samples recorded on the same date with 4 different dash cameras, 2 VIOFO A119 Minis running the V1.1_0902 firmware, one with HDR enabled, one with HDR disabled, and then I have 2 Vantrue E1 dash cameras with EBH261 firmware installed, again one with HDR enabled and one without HDR enabled. So you can compare them side by side and check out what you think the quality is of those dash cameras. They're all recording at 2560 by 1440p, 30 frames per second. As I get more firmware updates and I can check out the VIOFO A119 Mini updates to their HDR support, I'll create more videos. So come back and check those out. Otherwise, enjoy the samples. Thanks for watching.